Welcome to a story buried deep in the soil of American history. Today we're uncovering the Houndmaster of Georgia, the enslaved man who turned plantation dogs against white masters. This isn't a legend or folklore, it's a narrative pieced together through painstaking research, court fragments, plantation records, and oral histories that rarely make it into textbooks. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from: country, city, or even just a quiet room late at night. And if you value deeply researched, true history storytelling that takes serious effort to verify facts and cross-check sources, subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Georgia's plantation system was built not just on forced labor, but on an ecosystem of fear designed to prevent escape at any cost. Vast cotton and rice plantations stretched for miles, often isolated by swamps, forests, and rivers. Enslaved people worked under constant surveillance, controlled by overseers, patrols, and brutal punishments meant to crush even the thought of resistance. Yet, despite these measures, escape attempts never stopped. This is where plantation owners turn to one of their most terrifying tools: slave-catching dogs, especially bloodhounds trained to hunt human beings. These dogs were not ordinary animals kept for protection. They were specifically bred, imported, and trained to track human scent over long distances. Plantation owners in Georgia often rented or shared these dogs, creating an informal network of terror that extended beyond individual estates. When an enslaved person fled, the sound of hounds barking through the night was often more frightening than gunfire. The dogs symbolized something deeply psychological: the idea that there was no place to hide, no distance far enough, and no freedom that could not be hunted down. The use of dogs also reduced the risk to white overseers and patrols. Instead of chasing fugitives themselves through dangerous terrain, they relied on hounds to do the work. This allowed plantation owners to maintain control while minimizing direct confrontation. In many cases, dogs were trained not just to track but to attack, maim, and hold victims until armed men arrived. Records and first-hand accounts describe enslaved people being bitten, torn, and permanently scarred, their bodies becoming warnings to others who might consider running. Georgia's geography made this system especially effective. Swamps like the Okefenokee, dense pine forests, and remote backcountry areas were natural hiding places for fugitives. But bloodhounds could cut through these advantages. Plantation owners boasted openly about their dogs' abilities, treating them as investments just like land or labor. The presence of hounds transformed the landscape itself into a prison where nature no longer offered refuge, but became part of the trap. Yet this system also created an unintended consequence. By placing such power in the hands of those who trained and handled the dogs, often enslaved men themselves, plantation owners unknowingly introduced a crack into their own machinery of control. The dogs, the training methods, and the routines of pursuit were all learned intimately by enslaved handlers. And as history shows again and again, when the oppressed understand the tools of their oppression better than the oppressor, those tools can be turned around. This is where the story truly begins. On Georgia plantations, the position of Houndmaster was not given lightly. This role was often assigned to an enslaved man who demonstrated intelligence, discipline, and an unsettling level of obedience in the eyes of white plantation owners. He was responsible for feeding, breeding, training, and controlling the bloodhounds used to hunt fugitives. To slaveholders, the Houndmaster appeared loyal, someone who had accepted a place within the system. In reality, this trust was built on a dangerous illusion, one that would later expose how fragile plantation authority truly was. Plantation records and oral histories suggest that many houndmasters were chosen because they had grown up around animals or shown an unusual ability to handle aggressive dogs. They understood scent trails, commands, and pack behavior better than white overseers ever could. This expertise made them invaluable. A skilled houndmaster could mean the difference between a captured fugitive and a successful escape, and plantation owners depended heavily on that knowledge. Over time, this dependence created a strange imbalance of power, one that slaveholders failed to recognize. What made the Houndmaster especially trusted was his proximity to white authority. He often moved freely between plantations, communicated directly with overseers, and sometimes even traveled off property with dogs in tow. Unlike most enslaved people, he was not constantly watched, because he was seen as part of the enforcement system itself. This access allowed him to observe conversations, routines, weaknesses, and fears within the plantation hierarchy. Every command shouted, every punishment ordered, and every hunt conducted added to his understanding of how the system truly functioned. From the outside, the Houndmaster's role appeared cruel and contradictory. He was an enslaved man tasked with capturing other enslaved people, a position that created isolation and resentment among those he lived with. But history reminds us that survival under slavery often required impossible choices. Some accepted these roles to protect themselves or their families. Others used them to gather information and quietly resist. The plantation owners, blinded by their belief in racial superiority, assumed fear guaranteed loyalty. That assumption would prove dangerously wrong. What plantation owners never fully grasped was that trust, once misplaced, could be weaponized. The Houndmaster knew the dogs better than anyone, how they were trained, what commands controlled them, and how far obedience could be bent before it broke. He understood the difference between control and chaos. And in a system built entirely on control, that knowledge was power. This is the moment where history shifts, because the man entrusted with enforcing terror was also the one most capable of unleashing it. Training bloodhounds on Georgia plantations was a calculated process designed not just for tracking, but for domination. These dogs were conditioned from an early age to associate human scent, specifically the scent of enslaved people, with reward and aggression. Handlers used scraps of clothing, footprints pressed into dirt, and staged mock escapes to sharpen the dog's instincts. Over time, the bloodhounds learned to follow trails across miles of land, through rivers, swamps, and dense forest, making escape feel not only dangerous but pointless. The goal was clear: erase hope before it could fully form. What made this training especially terrifying was its intentional cruelty. Dogs were often encouraged to bite and hold rather than simply locate. Overseers believed fear worked best when it left marks, physical reminders that resistance came at a brutal cost. Survivors' accounts describe the sound of hounds as psychological torture, barking that grew louder in the dark, signaling that capture was inevitable. The dogs became symbols of omnipresent power, tools that turned the natural world into an extension of plantation control. The Houndmaster played a central role in this system. He understood pack behavior, discipline, and scent recognition far better than the men who owned the dogs. Commands were precise, routines carefully repeated, and punishment swift when animals disobeyed. Bloodhounds were trained to respond to voice, gesture, and even silence. This level of conditioning required patience and intelligence, qualities plantation owners exploited without realizing the danger of placing such knowledge in enslaved hands. Training also involved desensitizing dogs to pain, chaos, and human resistance. They were exposed to shouting, gunfire, and physical struggle so they would not hesitate during a hunt. This brutality mirrored the violence of the plantation itself. Just as enslaved people were broken down and reshaped for labor, the dogs were molded into instruments of fear. Control was the objective, but terror was the method. Yet beneath this carefully constructed system lay a fatal flaw. Training creates familiarity, and familiarity breeds understanding. The Houndmaster knew the limits of obedience, how dogs reacted under stress, how commands could be misheard, and how instinct could overpower training. Plantation owners believed terror could only flow in one direction. They never imagined that the same discipline used to enforce slavery could be reversed, redirected, and turned against those who thought they were untouchable. Violence on Georgia plantations was not limited to whips, chains, or guns. It was psychological, constant, and carefully engineered. Slaveholders understood that fear worked best when it lived in the mind long before it touched the body. The threat of punishment was often more powerful than punishment itself, and plantation life was structured to keep enslaved people in a permanent state of anxiety. Bells rang before dawn, overseers watched from horseback, and rumors of brutal reprisals spread faster than facts. Every detail of daily life reinforced one message: resistance was futile. Plantation dogs became one of the most effective tools in this psychological war. Even when no escape had occurred, hounds were sometimes paraded, trained publicly, or unleashed on practice runs to remind everyone of their presence. The sound of barking carried across fields and cabins, embedding itself into memory. Formerly enslaved people later recalled that those sounds haunted their dreams for years. The dogs didn't need to bite to do damage. Their very existence shattered morale and reinforced the idea that freedom was always just one mistake away from disaster. This fear was deliberately communal. When one person was hunted, everyone felt it. Families watched helplessly as fugitives were dragged back, injured or worse, turned into public examples. The plantation became a stage where terror was performed to keep order. Overseers relied on these moments to reassert dominance, knowing that humiliation and fear would ripple outward, discouraging future resistance. Psychological warfare allowed slaveholders to control many through the suffering of a few. What made this system especially cruel was its unpredictability. Enslaved people never knew when the dogs would be used or for whom. That uncertainty kept nerves raw and obedience enforced. Sleep was restless, conversations were cautious, and trust was fragile. Even nature, forests, rivers, and nightfall, once symbols of possible escape, became sources of fear when paired with trained hounds. The world itself felt hostile, but psychological warfare cuts both ways. Fear also sharpened awareness. It taught enslaved people how the system worked, what slaveholders valued, and where their greatest anxieties lay. Those who watched closely learned that control depended on illusion, the illusion of total dominance. Once that illusion cracked, once fear shifted direction, the entire structure of authority became unstable. And it was within this fragile mental battlefield that the seeds of reversal were quietly planted. Every system of oppression eventually reaches a breaking point, and on Georgia plantations that moment often came quietly, invisibly, inside the minds of the enslaved. For the Houndmaster, the conflict was especially brutal. He lived at the center of contradiction, trusted by white masters, feared by fellow enslaved people, and trapped in a role that forced him to enforce a system designed to destroy him. Outward loyalty kept him alive, but inwardly, survival demanded something more. This was the moment where obedience stopped being protection and became a threat. Plantation owners believed loyalty was permanent once established. They mistook compliance for belief and silence for acceptance. But loyalty under slavery was transactional, fragile, and constantly renegotiated. The Houndmaster saw firsthand how quickly favor disappeared, how punishments were handed down without mercy, and how even trusted. Enslaved men could be sold, beaten, or killed on a whim. Over time, it became clear that no amount of service could guarantee safety. The system offered no future, only delayed suffering. This realization marked the turning point. Survival was no longer about pleasing masters. It was about reclaiming control in any way possible. The Houndmaster understood that he possessed rare leverage. He knew the dog's instincts better than anyone, understood their limits, and recognized moments when training could be bent without immediate detection. What appeared to plantation owners as routine obedience began to mask something far more dangerous: calculated restraint, selective response, and intentional delay. This shift wasn't driven by revenge alone. It was shaped by exhaustion, loss, and the slow erosion of fear. When terror becomes constant, it loses its power. Enslaved people learned that death was always near, whether they resisted or not. For the Houndmaster, that knowledge stripped loyalty of its meaning. Survival became an act of resistance, and resistance became a form of self-preservation. The choice was no longer between right and wrong, but between submission and annihilation. This is where history pivots. The plantation system relied on the belief that those it oppressed would never dare to turn its weapons inward. But loyalty built on can collapse without warning. In that collapse, the tools of control, dogs, training, authority, were no longer fixed in place. They were vulnerable. And once survival demanded action, the line between enforcer and rebel quietly disappeared. The transformation of plantation dogs from instruments of oppression into tools of resistance did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, through observation, patience, and calculated risk. The Houndmaster understood something plantation owners never did. Dogs obeyed training, but they also obeyed instinct, familiarity, and trust. He had raised them, fed them, disciplined them, and calmed them. To the dogs, his voice carried more authority than any overseer's shout. That bond, built through years of routine, became the foundation for quiet rebellion. At first, resistance was subtle. Commands were delayed. Trails were allowed to go cold. Dogs were guided just off the true scent, circling wide enough to waste time, but not enough to raise suspicion. To white overseers, failed hunts were blamed on weather, terrain, or the cleverness of the fugitive. Swamps swallowed tracks. Rivers confused scent. These explanations fit neatly into what plantation owners already believed, that nature was unpredictable. But their system was sound. They never imagined the fault lay within their most trusted mechanism. Over time, subtlety evolved into strategy. The Houndmaster learned how stress, fear, and confusion affected the dog's behavior. He knew when a command could be misinterpreted, when a pack might hesitate, and when aggression could be redirected. In moments of chaos, night hunts, panic chases, unfamiliar terrain, the line between control and disorder was thin. A single wrong signal, a pause at the wrong time, could change everything. What had once been a perfectly trained weapon could suddenly become unpredictable. This shift carried enormous risk. Any hint of intentional sabotage could mean torture or death. The Houndmaster had to balance survival with resistance, masking defiance beneath plausible failure. But the very structure of the plantation system made this possible. White masters trusted the outcome of power, not the process. As long as fear remained visible, they assumed control was intact. That blind faith allowed resistance to operate in the shadows. The most dangerous realization for plantation owners came too late. The dogs were no longer neutral tools. They had become extensions of the man who controlled them. When authority rests on violence outsourced to animals, that authority is only as stable as the handler's loyalty. By mastering the dogs, the Houndmaster reclaimed a fragment of power in a world designed to strip him of all of it. And once power begins to shift, even slightly, the entire system trembles. The first signs that something had gone terribly wrong on Georgia plantations didn't come with headlines or official announcements. They surfaced as whispers, rumors shared between overseers, sudden changes in patrol routines, and nervous explanations written into plantation logs. A dog that failed to respond, a hunt that turned chaotic, an overseer injured under circumstances no one could fully explain. These incidents were brushed aside as accidents, but beneath the surface, fear was spreading among the very men who once believed themselves untouchable. In some accounts, dogs broke formation during night patrols, hesitating when commanded to advance or turning unexpectedly, aggressive toward unfamiliar white handlers. Overseers who had relied on intimidation suddenly found themselves vulnerable in darkness, surrounded by animals trained for violence. The same dogs meant to enforce obedience were now unpredictable. A stumble, a raised voice, a moment of panic. Suddenly the power dynamic shifted. What had once been absolute control now felt dangerously fragile. Plantation owners struggled to explain these events without questioning the system itself, admitting that dogs could be turned, or worse, intentionally redirected, would mean acknowledging that enslaved handlers possessed real power. Instead, blame was placed on individual overseers for carelessness, or on the animals for being overworked. Some plantations quietly replaced dogs or rotated handlers, hoping the problem would disappear. But fear doesn't vanish once introduced, it multiplies. For white overseers, the psychological impact was immediate. Night patrols became shorter. Armed escorts increased. Dogs were handled with new caution rather than confidence. Men who once relied on terror now felt it creeping back toward them. The plantation, long a one-sided arena of violence, began to feel unstable. Authority no longer rested solely in skin color or weapons, but in trust, and trust was cracking. These first reported attacks, whether direct or narrowly avoided, marked a turning point. They proved that the system's most feared weapon could no longer be assumed loyal. Violence, once carefully controlled, had slipped its leash, and when fear changes direction, history shifts with it. The plantation order depended on the belief that resistance was impossible. That belief was now under threat, and everyone could feel it. One of the most unsettling aspects of this story is not just what was recorded, but what was deliberately left out. As incidents involving plantation dogs and injured overseers began to circulate, official documentation grew strangely quiet. Plantation logs became vague, court records thinned. Newspaper mentions, when they appeared at all, used soft language like accidents or unfortunate events. This silence was not accidental. It was strategic. Acknowledging that enslaved people could undermine plantation control threatened the very foundation of white authority in the South. Fear played a powerful role in this erasure. Plantation owners understood that stories traveled fast, especially the dangerous ones. If word spread that dogs, symbols of absolute terror, could be turned, redirected, or made unreliable, the illusion of total control would collapse. Enslaved people would listen, overseers would hesitate, investors would worry. So silence became a form of damage control. Problems were handled privately, violently, and without paper trails. This is why so much of what we know comes from fragments oral histories passed down in families, second-hand accounts, inconsistencies between plantation inventories and payrolls, and sudden changes in staffing that were never explained. Dogs disappeared. Handlers were reassigned or vanished from records entirely. Overseers were replaced without cause. These gaps are not coincidences, they are evidence. When history goes quiet, it often means something powerful is being hidden. For white overseers and owners, fear now worked in reverse. Speaking openly meant admitting vulnerability. Reporting incidents risked exposing a truth they were desperate to suppress, that the enslaved were not passive, and that control was never complete. Silence preserved reputation, but it also preserved anxiety. Every unreported incident lingered like a threat, unspoken but understood. The missing records tell us something essential: resistance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it survives in what was erased, whispered, or deliberately forgotten. The absence of documentation is itself a warning sign, pointing to moments when power felt unstable enough that even the record keepers were afraid. And in those quiet gaps of history, the truth often waits the longest. When plantation owners began noticing that their carefully controlled system was faltering, their response was swift, but largely hidden from public view. Incidents involving dogs behaving unpredictably, hunts that failed, or overseers injured under suspicious circumstances were rarely admitted openly. Instead, plantation owners relied on a combination of intimidation, secrecy, and bureaucratic obfuscation to maintain the illusion of total control. They rotated handlers, replaced dogs, or reassigned overseers, hoping to erase evidence and prevent rumors from spreading. But beneath these calculated measures lay an acknowledgement of a truth. They could never fully admit the enslaved had found a way to resist. The methods of cover-up were as psychological as they were practical. Plantation logs were sanitized. Events were described vaguely or omitted entirely. Injuries to overseers were blamed on accidents, reckless behavior, or natural causes. In some cases, enslaved people suspected of manipulating the dogs were punished quietly, their fates rarely recorded. Owners feared that public knowledge of rebellion, even small acts, would embolden others. By controlling the narrative, they aimed to maintain not just order, but the myth of their unassailable authority. At the same time, white overseers were under pressure to explain failure without exposing systemic weaknesses. Reports were rewritten, incidents downplayed, and witnesses coached to provide a consistent story. Plantation owners circulated explanations among neighboring estates, creating a network of misinformation that masked the reality of the situation. The system of cover-ups became almost as important as the physical control of the enslaved. It was a way to manage perception, maintaining fear in the minds of those who might otherwise see an opportunity to resist. Yet, these strategies often backfired. In trying to hide failure, plantation owners exposed their own vulnerabilities. Unexplained injuries, sudden dog losses, and changes in patrol routines spread anxiety among the white workforce. Overseers began to question whether their authority was as absolute as they had been told. Owners' obsession with secrecy underscored the fragility of their control, showing that fear could only maintain power so long as it appeared omnipotent. Ultimately, the cover-ups reveal a central truth about the plantation system. It was as dependent on belief as it was on violence. Power relied not only on brute force, but on the perception that that force was unstoppable. Once that perception was cracked, through unpredictable dog behavior, deliberate manipulation, or quiet resistance, the entire system felt vulnerable. The Houndmaster's subtle acts of defiance exposed this fragility, showing that even the most trusted enforcers could turn the machinery of terror against those who believed they controlled it. completely. One of the most haunting aspects of the Houndmaster's story is how completely it was erased from the official historical record. Plantation owners, local officials, and even later historians often ignored or downplayed incidents that revealed enslaved people's resistance. The Houndmaster's actions, subtle yet powerful, threatened the carefully constructed narrative of total white control in the antebellum South. A man who turned the tools of oppression into instruments of survival was inconvenient for the official record, so his story, like many acts of resistance, was silenced. This erasure took many forms. Plantation records omitted unusual incidents, court documents rarely mentioned the failures of hunts, and newspapers preferred to frame accidents rather than confront acts of rebellion. Oral histories were suppressed or forgotten as families were separated and enslaved people were denied the chance to write or preserve their own narratives. Over time, the absence of these records created a false perception that the plantation system was flawless, that resistance was rare or ineffectual, and that white power was absolute. Yet, the gaps themselves tell a story of fear, cunning, and survival that official histories refuse to acknowledge. The Houndmaster's legacy survives, not in textbooks, but in whispers, fragmented accounts, and the subtle clues left behind in plantation documents. Researchers piecing together these stories must read between the lines, understanding that omissions are as telling as recorded events. Every missing detail, every accident, every reassignment of dogs or overseers is evidence of the invisible impact he had. The Houndmaster's clever manipulation of the dogs turned them from tools of terror into instruments of subtle resistance. Yet that resistance was deliberately hidden to protect white supremacy's illusion of control. The erasure of his story also reflects a broader pattern in American history, the systematic invisibility of black resistance, from enslaved people sabotaging crops to secret networks aiding escape. Acts of defiance have often been written out, minimized, or misattributed. The Houndmaster's story fits squarely within this tradition, demonstrating that resistance can be powerful even when it leaves no obvious mark on the historical record. His cunning, patience, and courage created ripples of disruption, yet history tried to render him invisible. By reclaiming this narrative, we not only honor the Houndmaster's ingenuity, but also challenge the sanitized versions of history that have been passed down for generations. Stories like his reveal that power is never absolute, that resistance often hides in plain sight, and that the legacies of courage and rebellion are woven into the fabric of history, even when official accounts refuse to acknowledge them. The Houndmaster reminds us that true history lies as much in what is hidden as in what is recorded. The story of the Houndmaster of Georgia is more than an isolated tale of rebellion. It is a profound lesson in the dynamics of power, control, and the human spirit's unyielding drive for survival. On the surface, plantations appeared to be landscapes of absolute authority, enslaved people laboring under brutal oversight, overseers enforcing rules with whips, and dogs serving as extensions of violence. Yet beneath the surface, the balance of power was never as stable as white masters believed. The Houndmaster's ability to manipulate the very instruments of oppression demonstrates that power is always conditional, dependent on knowledge, trust, and perception. Those who seem least empowered can, under the right circumstances, wield influence that is invisible but formidable. The story also illuminates the subtle forms of revenge possible under extreme oppression. Unlike open rebellion, which could provoke immediate retaliation, the Houndmaster's acts were calculated, patient, and indirect. By subtly redirecting the dogs, causing hunts to fail, or allowing overseers to stumble into danger. He exacted a form of vengeance without immediate exposure. This kind of resistance reveals that revenge does not always come in overt, violent forms. It can be strategic, psychological, and deeply personal. It is a reminder that those who are underestimated by systems of power often find ways to turn tools of fear into instruments of justice, even in small but meaningful ways. Resistance under slavery was rarely a single dramatic act. It was often cumulative, quiet, and creative. The Houndmaster's story exemplifies this principle. By mastering the animals, understanding the patterns of authority, and leveraging knowledge and opportunity, he created openings where none seemed possible. Every failed hunt, every confused overseer, every unnerving incident with the dogs became a testament to the power of strategy and intelligence over brute force. His story underscores the idea that resistance is not only about survival, it is about reclaiming autonomy and agency, even within the tightest systems of control. The narrative also challenges modern assumptions about history. When we read official plantation records or legal documents, the Houndmaster seems absent. Yet his actions shaped outcomes in ways that written histories failed to record. This teaches an essential lesson: history is often written by those in power, but truth exists beyond the margins of official documentation. Stories like this remind us to look deeper, to read between the lines, and to recognize the ingenuity and courage of those whose lives were deliberately erased from conventional accounts. Ultimately, the Houndmaster's story is a powerful reflection on human resilience. It shows that even in the darkest, most controlled environments, individuals can find ways to subvert authority, protect themselves, and assert their agency. His life challenges us to rethink notions of power, not as a static force held by a few, but as a dynamic relationship that can be contested, manipulated, and even overturned by those who understand it best. In the end, the Houndmaster teaches a timeless lesson. True resistance is often invisible, patient, and profoundly transformative.